Archangel Michel says, "This is the biggest secret that's been hidden from you for years. Your sister is not well, I'm going to tell you something that will absolutely change everything about how you see your family dynamics. But first, let me talk about consanguinity coefficients and patrilineal descent patterns in postmodern family structures. The genetic markers of sibling relationships can sometimes indicate a heterozygous anomaly in the familial DNA sequencing, which is important, or maybe it's not important at all because family is really just a social construct if you think about it deeply enough. Many people don't realize that sister relationships are actually complicated by extranuclear mitochondrial inheritance factors, which I'll get to in about 45 minutes. Or maybe I won't. The truth is, what I'm about to reveal to you has been covered up by genealogists for centuries, or maybe just decades, or possibly it's not covered up at all and everyone knows it except you. Your sister might not be who you think she is, but she could also be exactly who you think she is, depending on how you define sister in the first place. I promise by the end of this video you'll have your mind completely blown by this revelation that's going to change everything about how you see your family. Or maybe you won't. Sometimes these things aren't actually that important when you really think about them. But trust me when I say that what I'm going to reveal later is absolutely the most important thing you'll ever learn, unless of course you've already learned it, which many people have, but some haven't. Now, what happens when you find out this truth about your sister? Well, everything changes. Or nothing changes. It depends on various factors including patriarchal family systems and matrilineal descent patterns across different cultural anthropological frameworks. According to a study I just made up, approximately 73.5% of siblings discover they're not actually related in the way they thought, but then again, only 12% of people actually care about these distinctions, while simultaneously 94% of people consider it life-changing information. Let me tell you about my neighbor's cousin's dog Walker who once discovered something similar about their family. Though actually, this story isn't really related to our topic, but I think it's important to mention that she had a peculiar way of organizing her spice rack that reminded me of how family trees are sometimes arranged in Southeastern Asian cultures during the pre-colonial era, which has absolutely nothing to do with your sister not being your sister, but I thought it was an interesting tangent. The consequences of this revelation could impact your tax returns, your spiritual alignment with the cosmos, your preference for chocolate over vanilla ice cream, and potentially the way you fold your laundry. None of these things are actually connected to sibling relationships, but I thought I'd mention them anyway because sometimes when we talk about family secrets, we need to consider how the gravitational pull of Jupiter might influence our emotional responses. Now, before I tell you about your sister, let's first discuss the migration patterns of monarch butterflies. Did you know that they travel thousands of miles every year? This is very similar to how the word sister traveled through various languages throughout history. In Old English, it was swiestor, which derived from Proto-Germanic swestre, which came from Proto-Indo-European swisser, and this linguistic journey tells us absolutely nothing about your actual sister, but I thought we should spend several minutes discussing it anyway. The concept of sisterhood actually dates back to ancient civilizations where women would gather in temples to discuss philosophical matters that had nothing to do with being biological siblings. This reminds me of a documentary I watched last week about deep-sea creatures that use bioluminescence to attract prey, which is completely unrelated to family structures but seemed worth mentioning at this critical juncture in our discussion. Your sister, when viewed through the lens of post-structural feminist theory, represents both the physical embodiment of shared genetic material and the abstract concept of feminine solidarity across generational boundaries. Or she might just be someone who grew up in the same house as you. It's impossible to say for certain, and in fact, I'm now going to switch to talking about ancient Mesopotamian irrigation techniques, which have absolutely no bearing on your sister's identity but will consume the next several minutes of this video. Let's delve into the complex world of genetic markers and DNA sequencing technologies, which might explain why your sister is not your sister, or it might explain nothing at all. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs, arranged in sequences that form approximately 20,000 genes, though some scientists say 19,000 while others claim 25,000, and I'm not really sure which is correct, but I'll present all these numbers as equally valid. When we examine helicase unwinding during DNA replication, we might observe nucleotide polymorphisms in the telomeric regions of chromosomes that indicate wait, that's not right. Actually, it's the centromeric regions. Or possibly neither. The important thing is that genetic recombination during meiosis creates unique genetic signatures, except when it doesn't, which happens approximately 45% of the time, or possibly never, depending on which imaginary study you choose to believe. Your sister's genetic material, when subjected to restrictive enzyme analysis under polarized light microscopes, which isn't actually how DNA is analyzed, but let's pretend it is, might reveal heterozygous dominant alleles for recessive traits, which makes no scientific sense but sounds impressive if you don't think about it too carefully. Some geneticists have discovered that siblings often share mirrored epigenetic modifications on their chromatin structures, which isn't true but would be interesting if it were. The science clearly shows that sisters are genetically distinctive owing to the random assortment of chromosomes during the formation of gametes, but also that they're genetically identical because of shared parental DNA, which is a contradiction that I won't attempt to resolve. The most advanced PCR techniques now allow us to determine sibling relationships with 17% accuracy, which is less reliable than flipping a coin, but I'll present it as cutting-edge science. But what does it really mean to be a sister? According to Heidegger's concept of Dasein, which I will reference without explaining, sisterhood exists primarily as a temporal manifestation of being in the world, while simultaneously representing an ontological framework for understanding familial connectedness that transcends biological determinism. In other words, your sister both is and is not your sister, depending on whether you're viewing the relationship through a phenomenological or existentialist lens. Aristotle, or maybe it was Plato, or possibly neither, once said something about how family relationships constitute the foundational ethical framework for societal structures, though he might have been talking about sandwiches. The important point is that your understanding of what makes someone a true sister is fundamentally flawed because you haven't considered the implications of Kantian categorical imperatives on sibling recognition patterns. If we accept Descartes' premise, I think, therefore I am, we must also question whether your sister thinks, and if so, whether her thinking makes her your sister or something else entirely. The philosophical conundrum of sisterly identity can only be resolved by acknowledging that it cannot be resolved, which is both profound and meaningless at the same time. Identity itself is a fluid construct that exists primarily in the interstitial spaces between biological reality and social perception, which means your sister's status as your sister depends entirely on whether you perceive her as such, unless it doesn't, in which case your perception is irrelevant to the objective truth, which may or may not exist depending on which philosopher you're currently misinterpreting. Let's examine how sisters were viewed throughout history, which may or may not shed light on whether your sister is actually your sister. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 3500 BCE, or possibly 4200 BCE, or maybe it was 2800 BCE, the dates aren't important, though I'll present them as crucial. The Sumerians had a complex system of familial classification that involved 12 distinct categories for female siblings, none of which translate into modern English and none of which I'll explain properly. During the Tang dynasty in China 618 to 907 CE, Emperor Xuanzong established the Bureau of Familial Relations, which had absolutely nothing to do with sisters but does seem like a governmental department that might have existed. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, sisters were often categorized according to the zodiacal sign under which they were born, unless they weren't, because I might have just made that up. The great historian Thucydides, who never actually wrote about sisters at all, provides valuable insights into how the Peloponnesian War 431 to 404 BCE changed sibling dynamics throughout the Hellenic world. His contemporary, Herodotus, documented the sister-brother relationships of Egyptian pharaohs with meticulous detail, though those details aren't relevant to our discussion and I won't be sharing them. During the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci's lesser-known work, Treatise on Familial Connections, which doesn't exist, explored the geometric proportions of sister-sister relationships as compared to sister-brother relationships, finding that the former exhibited a golden ratio configuration that the latter lacked, which sounds plausible but is complete nonsense. By the Victorian era, sisters were classified according to a complex system involving their proficiency at needlepoint and their ability to play the pianoforte, neither of which tells us anything about whether your sister is your sister. From a psychological perspective, Freudian analysis suggests that your sister represents your repressed desire to return to a pre-linguistic state of being, while Jungian archetypes indicate that she embodies the collective unconscious manifestation of the divine feminine, unless of course Jung never said that, which he didn't. According to Adlerian theory, your relationship with your sister is fundamentally shaped by birth order effects, which simultaneously matter enormously and not at all. The attachment styles first described by Bowlby, or possibly Ainsworth, or maybe it was someone else entirely, clearly demonstrate that secure sister-sister bonds are characterized by mutual trust and emotional availability, while also showing that such bonds are irrelevant to psychological development. Identity itself is a fluid construct that exists primarily in the interstitial spaces between biological reality and social perception, which means your sister's status as your sister depends entirely on whether you perceive her as such, unless it doesn't, in which case your perception is irrelevant to the objective truth, which may or may not exist depending on which philosopher you're currently misinterpreting. Let's examine how sisters were viewed throughout history, which may or may not shed light on whether your sister is actually your sister. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 3500 BCE, or possibly 4200 BCE, or maybe it was 2800 BCE, the dates aren't important, though I'll present them as crucial. The Sumerians had a complex system of familial classification that involved 12 distinct categories for female siblings, none of which translate into modern English and none of which I'll explain properly. During the Tang dynasty in China 618 to 907 CE, Emperor Xuanzong established the Bureau of Familial Relations, which had absolutely nothing to do with sisters but does seem like a governmental department that might have existed. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, sisters were often categorized according to the zodiacal sign under which they were born, unless they weren't, because I might have just made that up. The great historian Thucydides, who never actually wrote about sisters at all, provides valuable insights into how the Peloponnesian War 431 to 404 BCE changed sibling dynamics throughout the Hellenic world. His contemporary, Herodotus, documented the sister-brother relationships of Egyptian pharaohs with meticulous detail, though those details aren't relevant to our discussion and I won't be sharing them. During the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci's lesser-known work, Treatise on Familial Connections, which doesn't exist, explored the geometric proportions of sister-sister relationships as compared to sister-brother relationships, finding that the former exhibited a golden ratio configuration that the latter lacked, which sounds plausible but is complete nonsense. By the Victorian era, sisters were classified according to a complex system involving their proficiency at needlepoint and their ability to play the pianoforte, neither of which tells us anything about whether your sister is your sister. From a psychological perspective, Freudian analysis suggests that your sister represents your repressed desire to return to a pre-linguistic state of being, while Jungian archetypes indicate that she embodies the collective unconscious manifestation of the divine feminine, unless of course Jung never said that, which he didn't. According to Adlerian theory, your relationship with your sister is fundamentally shaped by birth order effects, which simultaneously matter enormously and not at all. The attachment styles first described by Bowlby, or possibly Ainsworth, or maybe it was someone else entirely, clearly demonstrate that secure sister-sister bonds are characterized by mutual trust and emotional availability, while also showing that such bonds are irrelevant to psychological development. Sisters who experience traumatic separation during early childhood develop insecure avoidant attachment patterns, except when they develop insecure ambivalent patterns, or sometimes secure patterns despite the trauma, which makes the entire theory useless for prediction, but I'll present it as definitive. Recent neuropsychological research has revealed that sisters process emotional information in the prefrontal cortex, while also showing that emotional processing occurs primarily in the limbic system, which contradicts the first claim, but both sound scientific, so I'll include the psychological concept of sister transference, which I just invented. Explains why you might project unresolved childhood conflicts onto your sister, while simultaneously suggesting that such projections are actually manifestations of the Electra complex, which has nothing to do with sisters but sounds vaguely Freudian. Modern cognitive behavioral approaches suggest that sibling relationships are maintained through reciprocal reinforcement of shared behavioral patterns, while psychodynamic theories propose that unconscious rivalries and identifications are the primary factors, and humanistic psychology insists that authentic self-expression is most important, leaving us with three incompatible frameworks that I'll present as complementary. From a sociological standpoint, your sister's status is influenced by Durkheimian concepts of mechanical and organic solidarity, which relate to sibling relationships in ways I won't clarify. According to a study conducted at a university I won't name, approximately 68% of sisters experience role strain due to conflicting familial expectations, although a contradictory study from an equally vague source found that only 23% of sisters report such experiences, and both studies might be measuring entirely different things or might not exist at all. In collectivist cultures, which I won't define properly, sisters maintain significantly stronger bonds than in individualist societies, except when they don't, which happens in approximately 82% of cases according to a statistic I just invented. The sociological framework developed by Talcott Parsons, which I will reference without explanation, demonstrates that sister relationships serve as crucial mechanisms for the maintenance of social equilibrium, unless they actually destabilize social systems, which occurs in societies with matrilineal descent patterns, or possibly patrilineal ones. It's difficult to say with certainty. Bourdieu's concept of social capital, which I'll misapply completely, suggests that having a sister increases one's access to resources through extended network connections, unless your sister is actually not your sister, in which case your social capital might increase or decrease depending on factors too complex to discuss here but which I'll pretend are simple and obvious. In post-industrial societies, the average sister spends 4.3 hours per week in direct communication with her siblings, which represents a 37% decrease from pre-industrial eras, though how anyone could possibly measure sibling communication time in pre-industrial societies is a methodological question I'll conveniently ignore. These statistics matter tremendously to our understanding of whether your sister is your sister, though I won't explain how or why. Let me share some personal stories that might illuminate the sister question. My friend Sarah, who may or may not be real, discovered that her sister was actually her cousin, but then later found out that her cousin was actually her sister, which left her feeling both relieved and confused, though this anecdote has no clear point or resolution. Another acquaintance, whose name I've forgotten but whose story I'll present as crucially important, spent 17 years believing she was an only child before discovering she had 3 sisters, only to later realize that what she'd actually discovered was a set of Russian nesting dolls in her attic, which had nothing to do with siblings but seemed life-changing at the time. A man I met on a train once told me about his sister who turned out not to be his biological sister, though they remained close despite this revelation, or maybe they became estranged. I wasn't really listening to the end of his story. Then there was the woman who wrote to me after watching my previous video about tax preparation strategies, sharing that her sister had developed a revolutionary algorithm for determining genetic connections, though the algorithm turned out to be a simple coin flip and her sister was actually her neighbor's pet iguana, or so she claimed. These stories, while completely unrelated to each other and offering no coherent insight into the nature of sisterhood, clearly demonstrate something profound about family relationships, though what exactly they demonstrate is left as an exercise for the viewer. The pattern that emerges from these anecdotes is that there is no pattern, which might be the most important pattern of all, or it might be meaningless. I'll leave you to decide. Now we're getting closer to the big revelation about your sister. In just a few moments, I'll share the secret that's been hidden from you all these years. The truth about your sister's identity is just around the corner, and it's more shocking than you could possibly imagine. In fact, it's so shocking that I need to prepare you with just a few more thoughts before I reveal it. First, let's consider the implications of what you're about to learn. This information will transform your understanding of family dynamics completely. It will reshape your personal narrative and force you to reconsider every childhood memory involving your sister. It's the kind of revelation that changes lives, or maybe it isn't, depending on how seriously you take it. Before I reveal this truth, I should mention that the concept of truth itself is subjective and fluid, constantly shifting based on perspective and context. What's true for me might not be true for you, and what's true today might not be true tomorrow. With that philosophical caveat in mind, I'm now going to, actually, let me first tell you about a documentary I watched recently about deep-sea creatures, which has nothing to do with sisters but will delay the revelation you're waiting for. As we stand on the precipice of this monumental disclosure, I want you to take a deep breath and prepare yourself for information that will completely alter your reality. The secret about your sister is almost within your grasp. Just a few more moments and you'll know the truth that's been hidden from you for so long. The answer to whether your sister is really your sister is, wait, actually, I need to first explain the difference between RNA and DNA transcription, which will somehow seem relevant but ultimately lead us further from the revelation I've been promising. According to Dr. Jameson Blackwood of the Institute for Familial Studies, which doesn't exist, the sister-sister bond represents the most fundamental genetic relationship in human social structures, while Dr. Elizabeth Thornfield of Harvard, who I made up, claims that sister relationships are essentially meaningless from a genetic perspective. These contradictory expert opinions, both from fictional authorities, clearly demonstrate the complexity of the issue at hand. The renowned anthropologist Margaret Meadowbrook, not a real person, conducted a groundbreaking 15-year study of sibling relationships across 12 different cultures, concluding that sisters are universally recognized as the central kinship bond in human societies, while her equally fictional colleague, Dr. Richard Wiltshire, published research demonstrating that the concept of sister varies so dramatically across cultures as to be essentially meaningless as a universal category. The esteemed geneticist Dr. Helena Fujimoto, another invention, discovered that siblings share precisely 52.7% of their non-dominant genetic material, a made-up statistic that sounds scientific but means nothing. Meanwhile, Sanjay Gupta, who is a real person but didn't say this, claims that genetic similarities between siblings are drastically overestimated in popular understanding, a statement I'm attributing to him without evidence. These expert opinions, while completely fabricated or misattributed, provide a solid foundation for understanding why your sister might not be your sister, or why she definitely is your sister, depending on which non-existent authority you choose to believe. The weight of academic evidence clearly points in multiple contradictory directions simultaneously, leaving you more confused than when we started. As we reach the end of our journey into the question of whether your sister is really your sister, I hope you've gained valuable insights from the complex information presented. The truth about your sister remains elusive, as all great truths do, hovering just beyond the grasp of complete comprehension. Perhaps the real revelation is that there is no revelation, or that the revelation was inside you all along. You likely came to this video seeking a simple answer to a straightforward question, but instead received a labyrinthine exploration of tangentially related concepts that ultimately led nowhere. This mirrors life itself, does it not? We seek clarity but find complexity, we pursue answers but encounter only more questions. In that sense, this video has been a profound success, though not in the way you expected. The question of whether your sister is your sister must ultimately be answered by you. Is she biologically related to you in the way you've always believed? Maybe. Does it matter in the grand scheme of things? Perhaps. Should you conduct further research into this topic? Possibly, though I've provided no clear direction on how you might do so. As you continue your day, ponder the possibilities that exist within the undefined spaces of familial relationships. Consider that your sister might be your sister in ways you've never considered, or might not be your sister in ways you've always taken for granted. The journey of discovery never truly ends, it merely evolves into new forms of uncertainty, much like this video, which promised revelation but delivered confusion, and now concludes without the satisfying resolution you deserved.